Guys ready? Okay.
Mr. Chairman, we're live now.
All right. We'll call this meeting to order. And this is the Ag Committee first meeting of the budget session. And I think we'll do roll call first and then we'll do the housekeeping things.
Representative Blackburn. Vice Chair Clausen. Representative Fortner.
Here.
Representative Heiner. Representative Larson.
Here.
Representative Western. Representative Worth. Representative Winter.
Here.
Chairman Eklund.
Michael, there it goes. Here. So we'll start out. Our secretary had a few things to say, and then I will too. We'll kind of go over ground rules and things. Refresh everybody's memory. One of the things that's a little different, committee, from what we've been doing is our secretary is going to be handling the Zoom part of things. So it's quite a learning process. She asked if I wanted to do it, and I said no. So she's stuck with it. Go ahead, Carol.
Our speaker system's working. As you know, I'm Carol, and I'm with you again this year. There's coffee, hot water, and snacks available in the room over there. In your folder, you will find a plastic sleeve, and it's got blank absentee votes on one side, and then on the other side is the committee protocol and procedures. There's a salmon intern request form in case we do have interns this year, in case you're interested in that. There's a small notebook to take notes, and the pencils and the bills to be discussed for the day. I'll always have extra pencils, pens, paper clips if you need any of that. I have a small jar of cough drops and hard candy on the counter in case anybody needs that during this time. Many of you have already completed your emergency contact information sheets, and if you'll turn them back into me, I'd appreciate it. Any handouts regarding the bills for the day will be passed out prior to the beginning of the meeting. As I clean up after the meeting, if you have any leftover paperwork that appears to have notes of significance, I will take them to my office area, and I have a folder with your name on it. And I'll just leave it in there. If there's something that seems to be really important, like a cell phone or something, I'll find you. I'll get upstairs and find you for that. And with this being a short session, the deadline for interim topics already has its deadline, and it's March 4th at 4 p.m. And the forms will be available on the legislative website by February 18th. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Carol. So committee, I'm going to refresh our memories on how the meeting is supposed to be run. And I realize that a lot of what we do is very unnatural from our usual way of doing business. So, but we'll try to stick with it. The people talking, including the committee, will go through the chairman. The reason we do that is it's a more orderly meeting, and it's a good way to avoid chaos that can happen at a public meeting. We'll have public comment, and there's an order here, and I'll try to stick with that order. I've got committee members can try to help me stay with that order if you can. We'll close public comment, and I'll ask for a recommendation by the committee, and you can move and second the bill. And we work on amendments and discussion on amendments with seconds and discussion on the bill. Both of those will really go together. And we call for the question. We'll have a roll call vote on the bills. The absentee voting. So you can, if you've got bills you've got to present and you need to be absent, you already know how you're going to vote on the bill. You can leave an absentee vote one of the difficulties we've run into, if you leave and it's amended, your vote will count as it is. So if you didn't like the amendment, that's a problem with not being at the meeting. But I realize you've got other bills you have to testify on. And so that's how the absentee voting works. We don't, it won't be, it'll be voted on however it comes out of committee, if it's amended. If a representative refuses to vote, it will be recorded as a yes, I vote according to the House Rule 5.7. I thought it was a no vote if they don't vote.
It's a yes vote.
It is a yes vote. If they don't vote and they're present,
Yes, that's the way I understand. I can clarify that,
Okay.
but that's what we had.
I'm surprised on that. And see, I thought it was by the rules was called by the chairman. Okay, well, I'm pretty sure this must be correct. So if you don't vote, it's an aye vote, you're present. Secretary will announce the result of the vote. And motion to table, take it up later, no debate or majority, postpone indefinitely, it'll be put away and not brought up later. Both of these can be voice hand votes and don't have to be officially tallied. Those would be the motion to table, the postpone indefinitely. Question, the chairman is not obligated to halt discussion. You'll hear people hollering question a lot of times, but we're not done. And more than likely, I won't call for the question if I believe the committee's not done discussing things. And I think that's a personal preference on my part, but I think it's a courtesy to representatives to call for the previous question. The chairman must end debate. Okay. And it's a 2/3. So that we better get started with our bills. And I believe the first bill for consideration is land leases, House Bill 3, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. So to present the bill, our vice chair will work on that. A little history on it. We were asked by the governor's office to work on this thing, and it was worked on last year. And at the end of the deal, there were concerns about the bill, and it was vetoed, even though we thought we had it hammered out. We have some tweaks in the bill that hopefully will make it more palatable and won't be vetoed. So Vice Chairman Clausen will present the bill. You ready, Aaron?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our old friend, House Bill 3, state land preferences. This bill is in regards to when a chunk of state land lease is abandoned by its current leasee, and there are other landowners close that would like to lease it. Gives a preference to the landowners that are close. Works on the problem of scattered parcels that someone leases that doesn't have any access to it. They're far away that needs fencing. You guys have heard this bill. I don't know how many times. I'll breeze through it, but if there's questions, let me know. But I say this is our 5th or 6th time through this committee, but let's see. Page 4. Before accepting applications to lease, director should provide notice. Section A is the definition of preference. What vacant land is, just definitions. And on page 5, we go to the preferred right. Gives explanation of that, changes the preference to preferred right. like I said, that it's fairly simple. We've heard it a lot. If there's any questions, I'll go from there.
Off here. Let me get into the groove of things, shake off the rust and get my mic on. Go ahead, Representative Fortner.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I woke up about 2 o'clock this morning and thinking about this bill. And I guess my biggest concern is if somebody leases in the middle of a ranch already existing that this school section is on and it's vacant. This is a fence out state. Who's in charge of fencing that? The leasee that's going to lease it or the landowner? Somebody's going to have to fence it out because of the fence out provisions in the state of Wyoming.
Mr. Chairman, so this is actually geared at that very issue. So you don't have people that are leasing. It gives a preference to the landowners that are adjacent. So they can basically match the bid to avoid that very scenario where someone has to fence it out. But I believe it was the leasee that has to fence it out, but I'm not sure. You may have to ask the agency about it.
Can, and we will in a little bit. We'll have state lands up. Yeah, and I believe you're mostly correct on it. Sometimes there's a shared cost on the fencing.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes,
I'm sorry, I don't have pages 2 and 3. I don't know.
you know, and I ran into a copy that was that way over at the Capitol. Yep. Do we have any more copies? So some of the copies, and I should have brought that up when we started it. How many of you only have 2 pages here? Yeah, I saw that thing and I thought, where the rest of Bill? Yeah, okay. You have a computer? I've got a computer. I'm gonna share this copy down there and I'll pull this up on the computer and go through with it. I'd rather have notes. We don't have any other copies, do we? Okay, yeah. Go ahead and use that one. I should have checked that beforehand because I was up in the chambers and I grabbed a paper copy and it was missing some of the pages and I don't know what happened with the copying of it. So it kind of brings up the other Representative Fortner and committee. It brings up the other issue that arose when we started this bill. And that is that you've got basically a landlocked parcel of state land with no access. And other than a helicopter, I guess. So those were 2 of the issues that came up. Who fences? We had a case where a person got the lease and wanted to just turn his cattle loose on the land, the ranch, and use the other guy's facilities and water. That doesn't work out very well either. So hence the bill was brought forward. One of the questions, my first question when I saw this bill, because I'm new to the ag committee, was vacant lands. It just doesn't happen in my neck of the woods as far as state lands go. The lease just continues on. And but apparently there are some problems that happen in the states and what have you. That's what happened with both of these. The land was in a state and somebody hadn't paid the lease and it became vacant. It does happen. So we need to have clarification in the law. So that's part of why the bill is before us. Yeah, Representative Wharf. I think it's been in there a long time, and I think we have done that. Anybody have any history on that?
Mr. Chairman, I'll take a whack at it, but
Yeah,
I'm
go ahead.
guessing we're gonna have to have the agency on that one.
Okay,
In the old days, part of the state lands were reserved for like Fort Fetterman military purposes. Is that? I know very little about it, but I'm not, yeah, I don't know enough.
yeah. I think if No, I think we'll leave it in. I think maybe we had some World War II. Not sure what happened in the case of Heart Mountain. Do you know? Yeah. Euro, okay. Wasn't state land then. Maybe we need to leave that alone. I know.
But it's been a while since we had a war that took lands from the state.
Now we got proper copies. Before we bring the Abigail handout, the whole version, which we need. I'm gonna start with state lands, because I think most questions are going to be directed to you. And I realize there may be some concerns yet, and we may be able to work this bill into a fashion that state lands is comfortable with, and the governor's office doesn't have heartburn over either. So. Go ahead and identify yourself.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Jason Crowder. I'm the Deputy Director for the Office of State Lands and Investments. With me, I have Holly Dyer. She's the Assistant Director for our Trust Land Management Division. Director Scoggins sends her regrets for not being here to address you today. She is in appropriations discussing ARPA funding at the moment. So you get the B team, and I apologize for that. But I'm happy to answer any questions that the board or the committee has. We, as Representative Clausen mentioned, have worked this bill or this idea for quite some time. So we have a lot of history related to it, which is brought up a lot of questions, a lot of in the weeds type questions. We'd be happy to answer anything that you would have. But to address the issue that the bill attempts to rectify first, Mr. Chairman, I want to clarify, just as you did, that these are vacant lands. These are not lands that are currently held by an existing lessee. They're not under an existing lease. In fact, that's the definition within the board's rules, that vacant lands are those that are not held by an existing lessee. They went vacant for a very specific purpose. They didn't just happen that way. Either somebody didn't pay the bill on purpose, they let it go, they relinquished it back to the board on purpose, or something happened. A piece of paper got filed under another piece of paper on somebody's desk, and they missed the very specific deadlines that are outlined within statute, and it went vacant. So they didn't pay their bill on time. The statute is very prescriptive in how leases are to be managed on the part of the board as well as the part of the lessee. And there is a performance measure within those prescriptions that if a lessee doesn't perform, doesn't pay their bills on time, doesn't submit an application, does not submit a complete application within the deadlines mentioned within the statute, then the lease goes vacant. So there is a very specific reason these have gone vacant, and for whatever reason they are. And mostly it's lack of payment for whatever reason, like I said. So that leads us down the road of the conversation that if these are vacant for a very specific purpose, are they truly integral in somebody else's ranch? Are they in the middle of somebody else's ranch? Are they important enough to be considered in a preference discussion? And I only say that because that's the history of this conversation, that we're trying to make sure that we understand the lands that we're talking about. They're not currently held by anybody. They're just out there vacant. And so when you start from that premise, we start to discuss what is the process to get those lands under lease. And that's where the statute again helps and provides a very good prescription on how to have that happen and who to consider and what to consider when you're going down that process. And that's the historic conversations that we've had with this committee, as well as other legislators. What should that look like? Where should the preference be applied if one is applied, and how to more clearly write that in a bill that provides a good playbook, a good set of rules that everybody can abide by as we're going down this process. It's I think no surprise to this committee that the current statute is a little bit hard to interpret, and the office has done its best over time to try to apply the preference where appropriate, as well as inure to the greatest benefit of the beneficiaries, which is also in the statute. And that's the fiduciary responsibility that the office and the Board of Land Commissioners hold dear. And so that's how we have historically interpreted it, that we will apply leases or review applicants for parcels of vacant land based on their attributes to the best benefit of the beneficiaries. And then if we need to, we can reach in and find a preference and apply it appropriately moving forward. And that's a historic stance that the office has taken. It stood the test of time. It's been reviewed by the Office of Administrative Hearings several times and has been upheld. The Board of Land Commissioners has obviously ratified that interpretation going forward as well. As we've discussed this issue, it has taken some time, and the ultimate result last year was unsuccessful bill in Senate File 114. However, we do have a backlog of vacant leases out there. Quite a substantial backlog, actually. It's reaching over 70, possibly 100 separate leases that need to have this process so that we can move forward and place a lease on those properties to have them used appropriately, to ensure that they're generating revenue and that we have a good steward on the land. The Board of Land Commissioners initiated a rulemaking process last year to try to get that backlog whittled down, to give the office some guidance on how to use the preference as it was interpreted within the statute, and really just move forward with that backlog and move forward with the process. So on August 5th, 2021, the board approved an amendment to their Chapter 4 rules, which are the grazing and agricultural leasing rules. It was later signed by the governor and approved by Management Council on September 23rd of 2021, and they are in place now. Through that rulemaking process, obviously, we reached out for public comment, really only received one public comment from the Stock Growers Association, all good comments and things that we considered as we were writing the bill. And I know they're in the audience today and they can provide comments to the way the rules have been drafted and how they're employed right now. We have 4 parcels that went through this process that have just really finalized or were finalized through the process at the board's February 3rd meeting, I believe. The board ultimately awarding leases in that process. But the way the rules are written is that we offer a parcel of vacant land for lease. We advertise it. We accept bids through a sealed bid process. If more than one bid is received, we consider those to be conflicting bids. If we get conflicting bids, we immediately determine if one of those parties is eligible for the preference. And the preference is identified within the statute, 365105B, and it has several pieces of criteria related to what you need to have in order to be eligible for the preference. And I know that we're going to discuss this in the amendments to the bill, or the amendments that are provided by the bill. But basically, you need to be a citizen of the state of Wyoming. You need to have actual necessary use of the land, or you need to be eligible to transact business in the state. You have to offer at least the fair market value for the parcel. Those things in our mind and in our interpretation are all part of the preference criteria, not just that, as the bill indicates, owning or controlling adjoining land. So we determine that from the very beginning. If an entity does qualify for the preference and they're not the highest bidder in that initial sealed bid process, then we allow for a secondary bidding process to occur. And that process is determined by the director. She'll make a determination based on the specific attributes of the parcel. How many adjoining landowners are there? Is there access via county or some other public road? Is there a identified market for that parcel? Like several individuals have reached out to us desiring to use it, to lease it from us. Or is it something that's completely isolated within an adjoining landowner's piece of property? Is it completely isolated by the BLM or one individual? Based on that bit of criteria, we could either go into a live auction or we could do a secondary sealed bid or any of mixture of anything. But really, whatever the situation determines, we'll enter into that process. And from that, we determine who the best lessee might be based on the bids that have come in. So I think it's important to note that the preference, as the Board of Land Commissioners approved rules is employed, is that preference holder gets to participate again if they're not the highest bidder. If they're the highest bidder, obviously, then they win that first process and we don't go into the second one. But if they don't win, their preference is to participate again. And that's how we blend the preference, the individuals having all of the criteria within 36.5.105B and the requirement to inure to the greatest benefit of the beneficiaries together at that point. So we can always ensure that we have an appropriate and high bid and that those parties do get to participate again. Mr. Chairman, that's quite a bit from the history, and I'm happy to answer any questions. We do have some information or thoughts about the proposed bill, but maybe I'll pause there for a minute and answer some questions.
Yeah, committee, I'm sure you guys go ahead. Representative Larson.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. So do you have amendments that would get the bill kind of into what they approve for rules? Is there, I guess that's the question. Does the bill match that?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, it doesn't directly match it right now, and we can work on amendments to pull the two together. When we went into the rulemaking process, it was back in August of last year, and the draft bill as it's currently written was not anything that we could draw from. We had to draw from conversations with each individual board member and the conversations we had with all the legislators and the committees through the Senate File 114 process. Tried to pull all that together. Through that, it was very clear to us that preference needed to be identified. And so we did identify it, I think. One thing that the proposed bill does not do is demand the preference. There is a bit of discretion that was inserted into the bill at the committee's September meeting, I believe, that allowed the board to have some discretion that if a preference was deemed necessary by the board, then it would employ it in a specific way. But if it wasn't deemed necessary and that it may not inure to the greatest benefit of the beneficiaries, the board can make a separate decision and not utilize the preference.
Yes, go ahead. Representative Heiner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Deputy Director Crowder, for being here. As you're aware, when these bills come to the legislature, the LSO office prepares a fiscal note for us to be able to determine the impact fiscally that bill would have on revenue. And their fiscal note on this bill indicates that there will actually be a decrease of revenue for state lands. Could you explain that for me, please? Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Heiner, I believe that the intent of the fiscal note is in the process if the board employs the preference and utilizes the process that the bill indicates. And if that's the case, the process is very heavily weighted to the individual or individuals holding the preference. And that if somebody's not holding the preference, they're really kind of kicked out of that process. Their minimum bid could be used as a floor. However, they have no assurance or real path to being successful in the bidding process. And so we feel like they just won't participate. If they understand there would be an individual eligible for the preference, if they understand there's a high likelihood that the board would go down that road, that they just may not participate in the bids, and the number of bids we get would become lower.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So as I understand it, the role of the state lands office is to maximize our revenue from these state lands. And so with this preference right, someone that has that preference could actually sit back and wait and then just match the highest bid without actually determining what the value of that parcel is for his ranch or his property. He could just sit back in the process and be assured of getting the bid at the end. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Heiner, we're concerned that that could be an outcome.
I guess one of the things that I might bring up, if we've got 70 to 100 vacant parcels. We get this whole thing cleared up, it will bring money into the state if we get those things leased. I'm not sure that I understand. I'm not convinced that the fiscal note is quite accurate myself.
And Mr. Chairman, that's a fair point. We are limited in deploying those lands into a vacant leasing process because there wasn't a statute that we could follow. The statute where there wasn't a new statute provided to us by the legislature. And it was clear that the intent of the legislature was to provide us better guidance in employing that process. But the Board of Land Commissioners having approved new rules and feeling as though they have done so with the intent of the legislature in mind, we are moving forward with those at this time. There is a certain amount of leases each year that go vacant because people miss the deadlines, because people miss the payments. And so the longer we go without a process or without employing a process, those vacant leases have stacked up. This is not normal each year to have 170 to 100 leases available for this process, but since we've been out of this game for about 3 years, they have stacked up to that amount.
Well, that amazes me that, but we go ahead, Representative Fortner, we'll get into how we can conform this bill to what it will be helpful to get these leases out and used beneficially and for this.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Representative Fortner.
I guess my question is, why haven't you done your amendments on here before you brought it to us in this committee beforehand instead of going to do it later? I'd have to be voting no today, just on the few things that I heard that needs amended. We've had this happen in ag before, that is going to get stuff amended, then we get to the floor and it hasn't happened. So we ended up voting on a bill that the intentions was there, but they're not there in front of us. So we have to vote it down. So I'd have to vote no today on this, just on that simple reason. There's amendments that needs to be added. We should have added them prior to this meeting. Thank you.
I can reply to that if you'd like. So what's happened here, Representative Fortner, is we brought this bill after they had their rules meeting. It was in August or this summer, and then we brought it later. So we're going to try to, it's not unusual to amend things because we as a committee have ownership of this bill, and if we can amend it so that it works in a way that won't be vetoed, in a way that state lands can then lease out these parcels, that's got to be a lot of money for this, in this case, mostly schools. So that's why that's happened. So we worked the bill after the fact, and anyway, do you have any other response to that? Go ahead, Vice Chairman Clausen, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, so state lands had a few oopses on some leases. Was that before or after your new rules that have taken place? And has that been corrected and the situations all rectified, I guess? And could you kind of give us an explanation of what happened there and how this bill would apply, and maybe the new rules, how they swooped in? Or while we're having this conversation, make sure everything's caught there.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Crowder.
Representative Clausen. Yes, we suffered some problems through the COVID time period in getting leases renewed appropriately, and our communication with people who place conflicting bids on those existing leases and those existing leaseholders as well. That is a problem that we are trying very actively and with high priority to get to the bottom of. It's relatively isolated to the last 2 years, so we're concentrating our efforts on those. This bill wouldn't support that effort. That effort was a simple staff problem, office problem in managing what's currently in statute as far as renewing existing grazing and agricultural leases. I feel like we are nearing the end of that cleanup. period. It hasn't been fun and hasn't been pretty, and every situation is very unique and demands a lot of attention to ensure that it's corrected appropriately. But to your question, this bill necessarily doesn't solve that problem. That was an office problem, not following the statute and a different piece of the statute.
Representative Larson.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. With the number you have on that need to be taken care of, these leases, how quick can you get that cleaned up? And how often does SLIB meet? I probably should know that, the SLIB board.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Larson, that's a great question. Each one takes time. Each one takes a field visit to understand the attributes on the ground, the forage, the carrying capacity, the type of improvements that are out there in those conditions, as well as the access to the parcel. We have some of that information in-house, but some of it's rather dated, maybe back to the 70s. So we'll do an assessment to see if somebody needs to actually visit that property, or we can look at an aerial photo and get the same information and move forward with it. But obviously that takes a little bit of time for each one. We'll get into the bill in just a minute, but we do have a lot of discretion currently to determine how these leases are advertised. And depending on its situation, and as I mentioned earlier, if it has an identified market, if it has access, if it has a lot of adjoining landowners, or if it's completely surrounded by one landowner, I'll determine the length of time we need to advertise that parcel. So that would change it. The Board of Land Commissioners meets every other month. They just had one in February. Their next one is in April. So it's a little difficult to hit that perfectly with the advertising period and the analysis period. So it could take at least probably 4 to 6 months to get in front of the board, depending on when we hit the board meeting cycle. Each one of those leases, as I said, takes a varying amount of time to understand. And I don't believe we'll clean them all up this year. It's going to take a little while to get that done. Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, we have identified that, however, as something we need to work forward. We've addressed staffing needs and reprioritized some staff within the agency to be more concentrated on it. However, we have other jobs to do at the same time, so it's a little bit hard to reprioritize everybody.
So if the committee is ready, I think we'll get back to Representative Larson's question on how we conform our statute to what has been determined to be best by state lands and rules. So can you go ahead? Is the committee ready to hear some suggestions for amendments? Okay. Go ahead, Mr. Crowder, when you're ready, or either of you.
And Mr. Chairman, I don't know that I'm prepared to say these are actual amendments that need to be placed into the bill. I think they're worthy of conversation, and I know that individuals behind me are happy to talk to these points as well. And perhaps out of that, we can identify some amendments and provide them to the committee. But just to begin with, there is a deviation in the beginning on page 2, line 1, from historic practice, and that has been that the office has interpreted all of the items within that first paragraph on page 2 to be the preference. And the statute or the draft bill changes that to be qualifications. So they're no longer preference items, they are qualifying items to lease vacant land. And we would just like to point out that there are already qualifications to hold a lease. Those are within 36.5.101. And this seems to be a secondary set, a more stringent set of qualifications to lease vacant lands. And we're talking about the same lease here. And I just want to make sure that the committee is aware of that double qualification situation there. To further define that, 36.5.101 requires that you cannot hold a grazing and agricultural lease unless you've reached the age of majority, or you're a citizen of the United States or declared an intention to become one. This draft bill indicates that you need to be a bona fide citizen of the state, not just the United States, to lease a parcel of vacant lands. 36.5.101 also says that you can't hold a lease unless you have complied with all of the laws in the state and that you're authorized to do business in the state. That's found within the draft bill as well. However, there's an addition that you have actual and necessary use of the land. So that's an above qualification that's not found in 36.5.101.
Go ahead, Representative Larson.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. So I guess, are you saying that maybe the changes we made, maybe they shouldn't be there? Is that? Yeah, I don't know if you can
Mr.
answer
Chairman,
that.
Representative Larson, I'm just highlighting it for your.
All right. So go ahead, Representative Clausen.
Mr. Chairman, Director, so wouldn't the actual necessary use of the land to avoid like or bring help avoid situations where someone from, say, out of state that had no intention of using the lease would just tie it up for, say, conservation reasons and create that? Isn't there a pretty good argument there that might have a legitimate purpose?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Clausen, I think so. I'm simply raising it to your attention that that's not a qualification to hold a lease. However, it is our interpretation of a grazing and agricultural lease to be used for that purpose, grazing and agriculture, and not for conservation. If there's an entity that desires to use it for conservation, we have another vehicle, another leasing vehicle for that. And we don't deem them to be eligible to hold a grazing and agricultural lease. But in in the situation you're alluding to, the definition of actual and necessary use is rather broad and not defined, and could be a variety of different things, not just cattle, sheep, and horses. It could be something very small, very exotic for a very short period of time.
Okay, so so within the statute we have, because we're working off statute here, bona fide resident citizen of the state qualified under the provision. The statute has a provision that it's a citizen of the US. The statute 36.5.101, if I understood you correctly.
Mr. Chairman, that's correct.
And yet the statute we're modifying, there's no change to it. It's bona fide resident citizen of the state qualified under the provision. Is that part of what we're trying to clear up then?
Mr. Chairman, that's what I'm trying to highlight for you, is that the statute as written is identified as a preference in our interpretation that you need to be a citizen of the state.
Okay.
And that would be a preferential attribute, not a qualifying attribute currently.
Mr. Crowder, could you pull that mic up a little closer?
Okay. How are we going? So, so we're not even messing up anything. It's already messed up before we start, isn't it? How would you like to, so what's underlined is what we're changing. What's not underlined is already in statute. How would we amend this so that it conforms with the rules and conforms with, we've got to get, the statutes need to line up. We've got 36.5.101 that says a US citizen, and statute we're modifying says it has to be a resident of they have to be a resident of the state of Wyoming. How are we going to fix it? Got a plan?
Mr. Chairman, we don't have prepared amendments on this paragraph for you right now. And part of that is through the conversations we had with the joint committee in September. We raised this issue again, and at that time, we weren't given the indication the committee was agreeable to hearing amendments from us. So we could provide those to you, happy to do so. And what we'd like to do is, if the intent of the committee and the intent of this bill is to have them as qualifications, to identify them as such, and not just focus them on vacant lands, but holding all leases.
Yeah, go ahead, Representative Blackburn.
I don't think we're even ready to even be talking about this bill. They want amendments. They don't know what amendments. We don't know what to do. I suggest we table this bill.
If we decide to do that, then we delay for another year and pile up more,
Mr. Chairman,
possibly more vacant lands.
Mr. Chairman,
Go
I
ahead.
can't, I really love to vote yes on this bill. But the way it is right now with all the things I'm hearing, I would have a hard time voting yes or even helping this get out of the floor in the House with all the questions that are here. So why did the governor veto it last time? Are we pushing back on that, or what are we doing? I mean, we talked about this during the interim. We've had plenty of time, I think, during the interim till now to fix this the way it needs to be fixed, but evidently we haven't done it.
Last time it was vetoed, I believe, over concerns as to whether the beneficiary, which is mainly the schools, but there are probably a few other beneficiaries of the profits made on state lands, might not receive maximum value out of the parcels under the way this was written. And I thought we tweaked it a little bit to try to help that along. I guess a question I have, would we be able to, you're not prepared with amendments right now.
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. We're not yet, but we can even by the end of the day. Mr. Chairman, I do believe there are other people in the audience who will
Okay,
support that or speak to this point specifically, and we can offer amendments based on those conversations as well.
okay. Let's go ahead and bring some of them up because
Mr. Chairman, I got just real quick,
Okay.
a few other things
Go ahead.
throughout the rest of the bill. Page 2, lines 20 through 23, I believe are the changes that Representative Blackburn were talking about out of the September meeting, which does provide broader discretion to the Board of Land Commissioners to make decisions on lessees, where the previous bill required them to lease to specific individuals having specific qualifications. So we appreciate that insertion in the bill. Page 3, lines 12, line 12 requires that if we need to get into a bidding situation with applicants eligible for the preference, that'll be done so at a live auction, and it sets that pretty rigid. We've seen great success in being able to determine what's the best medium for offering those parcels in a competitive bidding situation, if that's sealed bid, if that's live auction, or if that's through an internet auction. So just raise that as a concern that we may be boxing ourselves in when discretion may offer greater benefits to the beneficiaries. And then again, on page 4, lines 1 through 5, it discusses how the office will advertise these parcels for lease when they're vacant. Currently within the rule, the board has told us just to do it by advertisement, giving some discretion to the actual situation that the parcel presents. So if it needs to be broad and wide advertisement or just very narrowed and focused, we have that ability to determine what that parcel needs as far as advertisement. And we appreciate that discretion because each situation is different. And there could be a situation where we do a lot of time and effort for not much gain here if we're very prescriptive in how we advertise these parcels.
Representative Clausen, go ahead.
Just a quick question. It just says, this seems to be not a very high bar. So before accepting applications, director should provide notice on the website or the office and by mail to each joining private landowners, and then any other means. So that, to me, that just says you'll tell the adjoining landowner, and that's not super prescriptive, and it leaves you enough room to do whatever needs to be done after that. But anyway.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Clausen, I think that's a fair statement, and we do a lot currently that's already identified within that paragraph. My point is just simply, sometimes there are 100 joining landowners to one piece of land, and sometimes we can't find all of those individuals. And so trying to be a little bit more nimble in how we reach out to them, if it's just via phone call or a knock on the door or something like that. Mr. Chairman, my last comments are on page 5. the whole page. This is a fantastic change. It really separates the word preference from preferred right. This paragraph speaks specifically to existing lessees holding existing leases. And in our office, we've historically interpreted there's there to be a difference there. However, the word preference has been problematic for us. So we greatly appreciate the difference between preference and preferred right. And then quickly, Mr. Chairman, that is all the comments I had to the proposed bill. But to Representative Fortner's question about fencing, it is a fence out state. So any lessees on state land are not required to fence the border of their state leases if there's private land adjoining it. It is the private landowner's responsibility to fence a state lessee out of their property. It's also true that if a cow or a horse or a sheep wanders off of private land onto state and it's there for some period of time, that we may consider that to be a trespass, and that the lessees are not necessarily required to fence those private people off of the state land or to protect their lease. There's not a provision within rule statute or the lease terms that provide for that. So there is a very weird situation there where a state lessee is not necessarily required to fence that boundary. However, they are encouraged to do so and encouraged to be good neighbors. And we do that encouragement on a daily basis. And that we have identified situations where trespass is occurring, where folks are coming onto state land, and we've addressed that situation through trespass laws and haven't had to go too far other than to just raise notice to the issue, and neighbors are quick to rectify those situations. So.
All right, so probably our main, and we'll have other testimony, our main sticking point is going to be back to that original paragraph where we have conflicting statute. Okay. Any other questions? Got another one here. Go ahead, John. Representative Winter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is there a statute at the present time that allows you to trespass these horses that are on private land and state land? You know, I'm speaking mostly in the southwest corner of the state, the checkerboard.
Mr. Chairman, if an individual who owns those horses does not have a lease to operate on the state lands, then we consider them to be in trespass if they are operating on those state lands.
So the federal government is in trespass.
Mr. Chairman, it's a great question. Happy to approach our attorneys with.
Have another bill, but yeah, good point, Representative Winter. Any other questions before we get other? Go ahead, Representative Fortner.
Thank you, Chairman. On page 5, lines 12 through 20, it talks about the process of the bid and receiving payment, then giving your 15-day notice. I know in Campbell County, my home county, people has got notice that their school sections is up. They pay their lease. And then there was one guy come down and he was told that if he didn't in 15 days sign the actual notice of I guess it was a rental notice. I don't know. I haven't seen it yet, but anyhow, it sort of talks about it in here. And my question is, pretty much throughout the state, if you write a check and somebody cashes your check, that's payment sealed and done. Why is it different with the state of Wyoming?
You answer that.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I'll attempt to. I'm not sure that I fully understand the question. I will say that it is the office's practice that any funds received in the mail or hand delivery or however are immediately deposited in the bank account. We don't like and have internal protocols that prohibit having checks just lie around in the office. They need to be tracked, they need to be secured, and we don't want them falling in the wrong hands or lost, basically. So if a check does come into the office, it does get cashed. But we do not interpret that as being an agreement between whoever sent us the check and us. It's simply a money management practice.
So a question I've got to try to clarify it is, Is this parcel already leased or is it vacant?
Yes, sir, it is.
It is already leased.
Yeah, they've been leased for decades.
More than likely, it's
Several
not going to
different
be
things.
addressed in this bill, correct? So we're just going to deal with vacant lands if you're, we'll talk about that, try to get answers for that in another format. Representative Western, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Crowder, on page 5, I want to say on line 11, it says the director shall grant the lease to the applicant holding title to lands nearest to the lands applied for. If OSLI's charter is to generate maximum revenue on behalf of the beneficiary, shouldn't that be changed to whoever's willing to pay more in that scenario versus proximity?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Western, this statute 365108 talks about a very specific situation where if a lessee who has the preference desires not to meet it or somehow is determined not to be eligible, and there are even bids in a bidding process, meaning it's already been out in the open market and we've received all the bids that we're likely going to receive for that parcel. This is the tiebreaker that the board is to determine who's the closest adjoining landowner, and that individual be awarded the lease. But we feel like it's already been in the market. It's already likely received its highest bid. And this is just a situation where there's even bids and the existing lessee has desired not to exercise his preference to match.
Mr. Chairman, follow up.
Yeah, follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. But if your mandate is to derive maximum revenue on behalf of the beneficiary, wouldn't it be fair to say, you guys are at even right now, we'll give it to whoever pays the most? In this foregoing opportunity to generate more money on behalf of the beneficiary?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Western, it could. We are always happy to introduce a competitive or multiple competitive situations to derive the highest bid. We also want to make sure it's the appropriate bid. It's a responsible bid and it's a sustainable bid. So if the committee's desire is to change that language to something different, we can absolutely help you identify what an appropriate change would be.
I guess a scenario I might bring up is there's a fairly, we got it with federal lands, but there's a landlocked piece of state land somewhere that somebody leases and they have absolutely no access to it. And they have to buy a helicopter to haul their cows in with, I guess. I'm just not sure. I believe that you guys have some rules that will help you decide what's an appropriate leasee. And it may not be the highest bid, but the highest bidder may regret that he ever bid the deal if he doesn't have any kind of access to the state land. Okay, I would like to have other testimony and move on. And you guys, what I guess I would like for the two of you to do is see if you can form at least an idea how we're going to fix B on page 2, how we're going to fix those conflicting statutes, because they're already conflicting. They're not really something we're creating here. So any other testimony out there? Any other testimony out there? Go ahead. Come on up. Mr. McGagna. State your name and help us along any way you can.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jim McGaggan with the Wyoming Stockbrokers Association. We've been very involved in this issue, and I could probably sit here for the next hour and answer a number of the questions from our perspective that have been raised today. In interest of your time, I'll just make a couple of brief comments and move on with a couple of amendments that I will suggest. We would be supportive of this bill as it is written, and I'll discuss primarily the lines 1 through 13 on page 2, which have been the subject of discussion. And we feel very strong, and we feel it's supported by the history of state lands, that those items are not preferences. Those are absolute requirements to lease land. The one about being a state citizen or qualified to do business in the state, I suppose that one could be debated. Do we want to require that or not? But the others that they are have actual necessary use for the land, that language was inserted in, I want to say about 2002 or 3 by this legislature. And it was in response to an effort that was undertaken by environmental groups who own no livestock or anything to compete against current lessees to lease those state lands so that they would not be grazed. And that was the basis for the legislature developing that as a requirement, not as an option. And I can even be a little personal because the case that led to that was an effort by one of those groups to take my state leases away from me at the time. And the other one in there is to pay the annual rental at not less than fair market value as determined by 365101. That needs to be a requirement, or someone could come in and acquire a state lease paying less than what everyone else pays just based on the annual rental determination. So we support the bill with this language as it is. We'd be amenable to looking at the residency requirement if that was the choice. But if all of these are changed to be preferences, then Wyoming Stockgrowers will be strongly opposed to this bill because we feel that was not the purpose or the legislative intent. Turning down to the language on line 15 through 18 that says that they have to be in good standing with the board. That broad language concerns me. If you've never leased state land, how do you have any standing with the board? If you're a current lessee and maybe your lease renewal or payment was received 5 days late, do you have good standing or don't you have good standing? So if this moves forward, Mr. Chairman, we would urge you to strike that in good standing with the board and insert some language that would say who have not been found to have significantly violated any law or regulation related to state lands.
Yeah, go ahead. Representative Clausen.
Mr. Chairman, just a question. There's an or in there that qualifier. Just making sure that isn't covered. Preferences shall be given to applicants who are the owners, lessees, or lawful occupants of adjoining lands. So there's a kind of a qualifier there. Do you think that's covered, or do you think it's something?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Clausen, I think it still raises question whether for anyone, how do you determine that they're in good standing with the board? They may be the current lessee, as I say, who was a few days late on a payment. It may be the owner of adjacent lands who's never dealt with the board before. So it just seems to me that, and I could go on and on about some issues we're addressing, trying to work with the board, with the Office of State Lands today over a number of leases, including one in your county, Mr. Clausen, where there have been some problems. And I think one of the difficulties we're running into, that minor little discrepancies, arrive a day late or something like that, are being treated the same as major violations. And that's where I think that this would need some language that distinguishes between actions that significantly violate the law versus just minor discrepancies that could be addressed more easily if the office had that discretion.
Okay. So your language would be at the end of that sentence, occupants of adjoining lands who have not been found to be in good, have not been found to be in
Who
good
have
standing.
significantly violated
Okay.
any law or regulation related to state lands. Strike the in good standing with the board.
Okay. All right.
Going on, Mr. Chairman, the preference criteria that are laid out, the scenarios A, B, and C. We think these have been improved significantly from what was in last year's bill. They were very confusing then. And at this point, I think there is value in providing that guidance to the office. So we would be supportive of that with one exception, Mr. Chairman. And that is on page 3, line 12, which calls for a live auction. Well, our people are used to live auctions where they're buying bulls or something, but a live auction for something as serious and that needs serious thought like this to get two competing bidders on a phone or something and just have them go back and forth, we think is not a responsible way to deal with this. We would urge that if the, as in B, 2 or more applicants have bid the same amount, you put it out for another written bid. And in a rare case, you may have to do that more than once, but I think in most cases, if both of the or any number of applicants know what the previous high bid was, they're going to calculate their own bids, and one of those is going to end up being the high bid. So we just think it's not a good practice, particularly where we have young people getting involved in the industry and they're anxious to move forward. That on a live bidding process where you're actually committing what you're going to pay for 10 years for a state lease, that it's just too easy for someone to get carried away and offer to bid an amount, and then 2 years down the road, the finances of their operation, which weren't given enough thought, does not enable them to continue to meet their commitment on those state leases.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So you're against live bidding as in being there, and you're also against online bidding, and you only prefer a written bid. Is that, am I understanding that correctly?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Blackburn, I think this is not a frequent occurrence, and we would prefer that it be a written bid. I mean, they could be submitted electronically, but not two people bidding against each other electronically. A written bid, or certainly an electronic mechanism, could be utilized to submit a bid.
Thank you.
All right, go ahead. More?
That would be all, Mr. Chairman. As I say, I'm working on some of these issues with the Office of State Lands, and there is, I know Representative Heiner mentioned, or Representative Western, maximizing the revenue. And I think there's an important distinction that this committee, the Joint Ag Committee, a number of years ago, and I don't know if they got written into statute, they had quite a discussion and provided direction to state lands that it's not about maximizing, it's about optimizing. And what that really means is you don't just look at, I get the biggest dollar today, but you look and say, what's in the best interest to assure over time that we're going to get the best return on these investments, because they're permanent investments to the state. They're not one-time investments. So I always like to bring that up because I think it is significant. There's also language that in some Wyoming Supreme Court decisions, it recognizes that it's appropriate for Board of Land Commissioners to consider, not that they should forego getting the highest revenues, but to consider the impact of their decisions on the integrity of ranches and on the ranching business in the state. I think it's important, but over time we've kind of lost some of that. But we keep that in mind, that we can do this job, we can do it to get great benefit for the beneficiaries, but we shouldn't ignore, and someone mentioned this earlier, often a parcel of state land is an integral part of a ranching operation. It has been for 100 years in many cases. And that needs to be kept in mind when we're looking at making some choices here. Leasing it to someone else, then it raises the fencing issue, which can be a huge issue. And the person who has that an integral part for their operation certainly should have to meet the high bid, but they ought to be given every opportunity to do that so that we maintain the integrity of our ranching operations.
Go ahead, Representative Larson.
Mr. Chairman, is your organization happy with what the SLIB board has come up with the rules? Are there some changes that need to be made? Can they do it internally?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, I wouldn't say we're happy with it. We would grant that they went as far as they could, given the current wording of the statutes. They didn't go get things the way we think they should be, but in fairness, they were limited in this very section by the current wording of the bid of the statute, which the confusion between what's a preference and what's a requirement. And a couple of items I mentioned here that we view as requirements, not preferences. We had asked the regulations to effectively make that happen. And the office correctly pointed out that the statute, the way it exists today, would not allow them to do that.
Go ahead, Representative Larson, follow up.
Mr. Chairman, I don't know if we have time to deal with this today. I wonder if we shouldn't table the bill until we have some amendments that we can work with. I mean, we're all shooting in the dark here. I think we ought to table this until the next meeting. I make that motion.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded, moved by Larson and seconded by Wharf first. So, yeah, so I'm trying to remember if this one's. Yep. No, we can't. We'll just go ahead and vote, but it's been moved to the next meeting, so we're not done. Yeah. 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 Right. Okay, so there's no debate. The only thing I'll say is, remember, when we get to these meetings, we've got a bill. It's our obligation to work the bill. And so we're not blowing this thing up. We'll be back. We'll be back. So go ahead. Huh? No, we're not going to have more testimony if we vote to table it until the next meeting, which was the motion. You have that motion. Second. Committee, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Okay, the motion passes, and we will hopefully have something that will make the bill easier to work for the next meeting. Yes.
If they have amendments that they would like to see brought forward, they bring that to the next meeting. So we actually have those amendments ready, so we can either include them or not. Because I know there were some, as it was mentioned, there may have been some in the audience that would have liked to provide a testimony. I guess if they have amendments they would like to see, I would say it's appropriate for the committee to make that request, Mr. Chairman.
Yep. So we'll
Mr. Chairman,
probably visit before the next meeting too.
Mr.
ahead,
Chairman,
Carol.
if they would send them to me, I can make copies of them so that you have them available even tomorrow if they can get it done, just so it's not just right at the time of when we have our meeting. So if there's anyone that has them ready before, can send them to me. I'll make sure they get to the committee for review.
Okay. All right. Committee, that'll be the plan, and people with recommendations, have them in writing. I think I understood them, but I'm not sure how we're going to fix something that's broken before we start, but we'll work on that. And that's that conflict of statute. Well, let's move on to the next bill. So committee, the next bill for our consideration is water permits livestock on federal lands. And I can share this, the committee's been through it. What this does, it's a little bit different, is the water, when water's developed on federal lands, the owner of the land is the federal government. So the appropriation is made to the federal government, I believe. And this would make joint ownership of that water right between the leasee of the land, the grazer, in most cases, and the federal government. And then it has other provisions. And I guess I would like to start by just bringing if the committee's okay with this, we'll try to up. We're going to be short on time, but I'd like to bring the state engineer's office up and see what they've got to say about it. The primary bringer of the issue isn't here today, so. Go ahead when you're ready, Mr.
Thank you,
Gebhardt.
Mr. Chairman. I'm Brandon Gebhardt, interim state engineer, and
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. I'm David Schroeder, member of the Wyoming Board of Control and Superintendent of Water Division 2.
Okay. So we have discussed it a little bit privately. You had some concerns with the way the bill was written. The committee's already kind of been through it. I'm trying to remember, were you present when we voted on this bill? State Engineer's Office make it to that meeting? Neither of you were probably around when we did that.
Mr. Chairman, I believe it was my predecessor, and it was, I believe, Superintendent Smith at that time. But I do believe
Okay.
that David is, had been involved behind the scenes and is up to speed on this bill.
All right. Well, go ahead. Go ahead with your presentation on how we get this to conform with what we actually do in the state engineer's office and what we need to do to get the bill to conform with state law and
Okay.
rules.
Mr. Chairman, I'll start off by saying that we currently have just renewed an ongoing MOU between the state engineer's office and the USDA Forest Service, the Rocky Mountain and Intermountain regions. That MOU spells out, among other things, but particularly what's in this bill, and allows us to operate with what this bill generally does. One of the things with this new MOU that was just signed in December, executed in December for another 5 years, is we included a provision in the new MOU in anticipation of this bill that puts in there that if state law requires, a grazing permit holder needs to be a joint or a co-applicant for a water right on federal lands. So that there's no issue there. That's the same as what this law is. The one discrepancy, and I'll let David take it over, the one discrepancy between the MOU and this has to do with the wording of obtain consent or seek consent. And I'll turn it over to David to elaborate.
Go ahead and give us the page number and the lines we're on with the consent.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The wording that differs from the MOUs and gives a slight pause is on page 3, line 14, and specifically the phrase "without the consent." Stating when a modification of a water right is contemplated under 41-3-104 or 4-514, generally the change in place of use or amended certificate statutes. The water right cannot be changed without the consent of valid grazing lessee. Now, the MOU state seek the consent, and there's an important difference there. The state engineer and the Board of Control have the statutory responsibility to evaluate injury with respect to modification of water rights. With the stronger language contained in this specific passage, it prohibits the state engineer or Board of Control to evaluate any injury concerns. By amending that passage to seek the consent, it would be consistent with the MOUs and keep alive that ability of the state engineer or Board of Control to evaluate any injury concerns.
So your suggestion is just leave out without, but, okay, so it would, to conform with the MOU, not be changed under 41-3-104 or amended under 41.4.514. It says without the consent, and we would say with the consent.
Mr. Chairman,
fix
I
it?
would suggest something after WS 41-4-514 without seeking the consent.
Okay. So we're not far off of what you need to, for the statute to conform with the MOU. Committee, any questions? Okay. Add another area here of concern.
Mr. Chairman, I wouldn't phrase it as a concern, but farther down on this same page under line 22, it talks about updating the names on the permit. And specifically, again, on line 22, filing for a name change with the state engineer's office. We do have a provision in rule that allows for a permit assignment. And typically that would be accompanied by documentary evidence, typically a warranty deed, or we see sometimes assignments on reservoir storage or ownership. So it could be contemplated to amend this slightly to say a permit assignment accompanied with documentary evidence. Given that, I don't see this passage as being that impactful to our operations.
Okay. Where would we insert that language on documentary evidence?
I would suggest on line 22 that that federal land by filing for a permit assignment accompanied with documentary evidence to the state engineer's office.
Okay. Committee, any questions? That really doesn't change the bill significantly, but I can see why you want it in there.
If you, Mr. Chairman,
Hang on a second. We got a question down here. Representative Fortner, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Over here on, it'd be page 2, and it goes down to line 15, all the way down to 22, and it talks about, they define stock, everything other than basically wild horses. But there's quite an advocacy group out there. If there's water to be available, what's the mechanism in this bill to keep the wild horses out of these water holes? Or is there any intent to keep them out? I know when I was working on the desert from the Colorado border all the way up to basically Cody, the wild horses, they had destroyed all the water holes that the sheep was watering in at one time. They was constantly rebuilding those water holes for the sheep. What mechanisms is there going to be in place to prevent that? This is sort of pretty wide open right here. It lays the grounds for stock. It tells what stock is, but it doesn't really say how we're going to keep the horses out of the water that these guys is paid to develop. You get where I'm going on that?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Fortner, I don't have a real great background on your concern. Of course, our agency was involved and has been working through this interim topic. You've heard testimony previously by former Director Lanning. I would say when the state engineer's office has delineated beneficial use, it's simply stated as stock use. And I don't know that we differentiate between different forms of stock. So I don't know that I can address your concern as far as this bill is concerned.
Comment. Go ahead, Bill.
I guess what I'm saying is the guy goes out and he puts a lot of money into developing water. How does this bill protect him from wild horses tearing up his water supply, because it happens all across the Red Desert.
I think go ahead if you'd like to,
Mr. Chairman,
Director.
I might ask a question. We're concerned with regulation of the water. Are you talking more of a civil type of a situation where it wouldn't be the administration of the water as much as it is private property and trespassing potentially, or those types of concerns?
Comment. No, I know we're talking water rights, to establish a water right so they could develop water. So we get past that point, we got the water developed. What mechanisms are in place to make sure that water is utilized by the stockman other than overpopulated horses out on the desert or anything else as far as that goes?
I guess I'd kind of like to interrupt. We're getting off topic
Okay.
with that because we've tried to deal with that with the other bills we have on the wild horses and burros. We also have the issue, we developed these tanks, wells, whatever they are, and wildlife utilize them as well. And I don't think anybody argues that that's a beneficial use. The horses have become, they're an issue that we have to deal with separately. And our state engineer probably just can't answer your questions. So any further questions for the state engineer? All right, thank you. I may have you come back, but I think I know what the changes that you're wanting, and they don't appear to be real significant. Public comment. Mr. McGagna, I'll give to you. I think it did. I thought it did anyway. So if we're on line 22, and give me committee if I'm cutting anybody off, but that federal land by filing for, and we take away a name change for permanent assignment with documentary evidence. And then, and for a name change. So we do have the provision for the new leasee to, I think so. Okay. Yeah. Committee, any questions? Well, I'm not sure, but I think some of the water laws may be different. The state engineer might address that, but when you've got a use agreement, a water use agreement in place with the state engineer's office, it usually is specific for livestock and domestic irrigation, whatever. Okay. Okay. No questions. So thank you. Oh, boy, yes. Can you turn it on from? Okay. Yeah, if you notice that ever, just go ahead and butt in and do what you need to. It'll take us a while. This virtual format is interesting for many of us. Come on up, Mr. Moline.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Brett Moline, Wyoming Farm Bureau Federation, sitting in support of this bill. I do have, on first blush, I believe the proposed changes will still work within my members' policy. I think it's extremely important to get the grazing permittees' names on these permits, on these water uses. But there was a comment made a couple of times how the MOU, how the state law has to agree with the MOUs and the rules. And I guess I look at that a little bit different. I think the MOUs have to, and the rules have to agree with state law. So I think through the law, you need to do what's right, and then the rules have to adapt. If I may, just real quickly, based on the conversation earlier about the feral horses, I believe some of the other bills that are coming forward will help direct the problems that we're having with the feral horses. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd sit in support of this bill and sit for any questions.
Committee. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other public comment? Come on up. State your name and while she's coming up, do we have anyone virtually online for this bill? Okay. Well, if they show up, let me know. Hi, welcome to our committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Amy Hendrickson, Wyoming Wool Growers Association. And I just wanted to express our support for this bill. And I think that the concerns that were raised by Mr. McGagna and the amendments that were suggested would address those concerns.
Okay.
And I sit for any questions, as Mr. Moline would say.
Committee questions. Okay,
Thank you.
All right. So we're closing public testimony. Committee, what's your?
Mr. Chairman, can I ask if the state engineer's office would like to comment on
Yeah.
Some of the questions
we
Mr.
did.
McGagna brought up?
Yeah, go ahead. And land use and some of our state law that might protect us from turning a water hole into a ski area.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, David Schroeder, Wyoming State Engineer's Office. I think I can address Mr. McGagne's concern. And I preface this with, I'm not an expert in Colorado water law, but I know there's chief differences. But in general, if something like that occurred in Wyoming, where say a federal permit for stock water was contemplated to be changed to another use, without prejudging anything coming in, I think there's a clear injury there. If someone has a valid permit to occupy that land, I think the board or the state engineer would take that into strong consideration, that injury concern. And I think the process is already in place to address those and similar concerns.
Okay. Any other questions for the state engineer's office? Okay, thank you. Thank you for your input. Now, committee, what's your pleasure?
I'll move the bill.
Okay, moved by Representative Larson, seconded by Blackburn, was it? It was, okay. Yeah, we have to recognize voices around here. So discussion on the bill. Go ahead, Representative Clausen.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to move the state engineer's amendment.
All right. Let's try to clarify it. There's a couple places where that's at. Okay, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, line 14 after without insert seeking. And I may need some help with the language and on line 22 permits. Get it written down.
Okay, I think I got it. Maybe you correct me if I'm wrong, but on line 22, by filing for a permanent assignment with documentary evidence for a name change. Is that pretty close to? Come on up.
Yes.
Wow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the word we're looking for is a permit assignment.
A what? Oh, a permit.
Permit
Okay. Now that makes more sense. Thank you.
accompanied by documentary evidence.
Okay. All right. All right. Thank you. Eddie. So are we clear on the amendment? So it's been moved. Did we have a second on the seconded by Larson, moved by Clausen? Do you have those down, Carol, what we've done? Okay. Committee ready to vote? Okay, on this amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Okay. Any other changes to the bill or discussion on the bill? Questions been, okay, questions been called for. All those in roll call.
Representative Blackburn. Vice Chair Clausen. Representative Fortner. Representative Heiner. Representative Larson.
Aye.
Representative Western. Representative Wharf. Representative Winter.
Aye.
Chairman Auckland.
Aye.
Thank you. All ayes. It is a due pass.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everybody. And we will, probably our first order of business Thursday morning will be to get back on the bill we started on. We'll hopefully have some clarifications there. Anything to add? We are adjourned with time to spare. Oh, hang on. Wait. Okay. All right.